for what is right. Live for what is right. Beg you do what's right. Christian man, Christian man. Stand up now. You know you must get up now. Shake off the coward's dust.
My fellow Christian brothers and sisters, we're discussing state of freedom. Let us look at free will and speech. Free will and speech. Free will and free speech. Free will and free speech versus right and wrong speech. Free will and free speech versus right and wrong speech. Free will, which we receive from God, is like the license to drive that you receive from the state. So free will that we receive from God is like the license to drive which we receive from the state or region of the country in which we live. For example, if you're in Oklahoma, you have an Oklahoma license. God's law tells us how to think, speak, and act. The state tells us how to drive. That is when you go to driver's education. God creates us to think, speak, and act righteously. The state creates good drivers through driver's education and the license process. So God created us as good. He said that it is good when He created everything, including humans. And when we receive our license from the state, we receive the confirmation that we are good drivers, since the bearer of license or the traffic organizations and those responsible do not pass people to drive on the streets who are not considered good drivers. The state creates good drivers through driver's education and license process. That is, drivers who drive by the traffic laws. Free speech is therefore like freely driving on the streets. Right speech is like right and correct driving. That is lawful driving, which is to drive by the traffic rules. Example, a motorist who stops on red and drives within the speed limit. A wrong speech is like wrong or incorrect driving. That is lawless driving, which is to drive outside of the traffic rules. Example, a motorist who drives on red and speeds. The authorities do not allow anyone to drive without a license. In the same way, God does not make a human to be or act without free will. Again, free will is like the license to drive. We are free to act or to be willful, not robots. The power to choose or to act according to decision. In the same way, we have the power to drive on the street, like we have the power of choice. In both cases, God who created us with free will, and the nation or county or state that issue us a license. In both cases, humans have the power, that is the power of free will and license. In both cases, humans have the power, that is one, free will, free to think, free to say, free to act, and the license, free to drive, but again, emphasis is on the power to choose to drive by the traffic laws. So in both cases, the human being has the power. That is power, free will, free to think, free to say, free to act, and license, the right or power to be a motorist, to drive your car or your vehicle. They are judged, in both cases, they are judged by the use of power. They are judged by the use of power. That is, God judges us by our use of free will, how we use our will, what we decide to do, what we decide to say, what we think. God judges our choices. Likewise, the state or country or county judges the driver's decision. If you drive too fast or you drive too slow, you might be reprimanded or have your license suspended or even revoked in the case of driving drunk or driving under the influence of a substance, careless driving. You will be reprimanded, maybe have your license suspended, you have to pay a fine or a fee, or even have your driving privileges revoked. But again, that would be after you have driven. Same way in free will, if we behave inappropriately, God judges us, and at one point we will pay for our choices. John the Apostle said, I saw a great number of people stand before God, giving an account for their lives' decisions, everything they have done, everything they said and did. Judge for our use of the power of free will. How they use free will to think, to speak, to act, and how they use their license to drive. So for the human, free speech is free will in action, like a licensed motorist driving to a friend's house. One group does not get to decide traffic laws. An individual does not get to decide traffic laws. If that were the case, one day you were driving incorrectly because you violate someone's traffic laws, not the state traffic law. So you could be driving down the street and disobey some laws, some traffic laws or rules or regulations, which someone made up and are not necessarily the state's traffic laws. God's laws should decide speech. And if there were going to be a correct basis for hate speech, God's laws should decide hate speech, since God's laws are eternal and good. A country limiting a person's speech outside the parameters of God and his eternal laws is godless and a hindrance of exercising free will. So when a nation that does not acknowledge God prohibits the speech of a person, most likely that nation would be interfering with the godly manner, character, way of life, or expression of that person, since there is animosity from that state to the manner, the culture, the beliefs, the values of that individual or of that group. And again, who decides what to say and what is not permitted to say? Or who decides what speech is acceptable and what speech is not? This is particularly godless when hate speech laws mean the prohibition of religious tenets, religious declarations, religious beliefs, and specifically for the Christian, when it means the prohibition of biblical thought and expressions, biblical values, biblical traditions. What is problematic about hate speech laws is that any expressed idea or thought that is contrary to the ideology and customs of the day could be considered hate speech. What is problematic about hate speech laws is that any expression or idea or thought that is contrary to the ideology or customs of the day could be considered hate speech. For example, to speak against slavery could be considered hate speech in the 1860s or prior 1860s, because you would be speaking against the way of that part of the United States of America. It could be considered hate speech in South Africa if you spoke against apartheid in those years of segregation in that country. To speak against apartheid, segregation, imperialism in their time could be considered hate speech. And how about opposing the views and traditions and practices of Third Reich, that is Nazi Germany, to Himmler, to Hitler, to Goebbels? That would be considered hate speech. To the Nazis, that would be considered hate speech. Hate speech could be any expression against the thought and customs of the day. Even more troubling, hate speech could be any expression that opposes the laws of the day, be it civil or evil. So if you speak against a regime, a system, an organization, if you speak against a land that is entrenched in evil thought and expression, and you speak against it, hate speech could be your righteous expression, your righteous condemnation, your righteous and just condemnation of an evil scheme, an evil law, an evil practice or custom, like if you spoke against slavery or apartheid or discrimination against women and so on and so forth. So the constitutionality of hate speech is no just a righteous ground. Your dislike for someone's expression, someone's beliefs, someone's thought is no just ground for hate speech, since any group could be ruling and the evil group could be ruling, and they can outlaw the thoughts or expression they don't like. The Nazis outlaw anything that they didn't like. If you're in the Soviet Union, they would not allow that which is democratic or the capitalist thought. When you are outside of the grounds of the Marxist concept in the Soviet Union, whatsoever you expressed, be it something along the line of capitalism or democracy, those thoughts would be forbidden. If we are going to have a free people, like Thomas Jefferson declared, if the printer only printed books or articles that they were convinced would offend no one, very little would be printed. Like the printer or the printing press or the publishing company, so should be government allowance of speech. Not because you like it or not necessarily because you approve of it. In an educational institution, when a student writes a research paper, be it a dissertation, master's thesis, or a senior paper, or a term paper, the institution, should they publish that work, would in the credit area of that research would let it be known or make the statement that as an institution, as a university, as a college, we do not necessarily support the views of this author, but the academic process, or for academic freedom, any academician, any student has the right to express his or her thought as long as you are scholastic or you support your writing with documentation. The views of Western civilization, the views, the political views, the values, the morals, the thought of the Western world, would be considered hate speech in certain parts of the world and in certain empires prior. Western civilization or people should ask themselves today, what would you do, or what were to happen when the nations of the world, for example, who do not support the values, the beliefs of Western civilization, what were to happen if they start to rule? They would forbid, they would prohibit the beliefs, the values, the practices of Western civilization. And history shows us that it is just a matter of time before a new region is dominant, new ideas, and they guide new civilization. And when these new civilizations come forth, they advocate for the prohibition or to outlaw thoughts, ideas, and practices that they do not accept at the time. What we have to think about is that the spirituality or ideology, the beliefs and values lay the foundation for every civilization. From those beliefs and values, we form the political culture. The political culture advocate for law and constitution. Now we have the law and constitution to support the beliefs and values of the people. And from those laws and constitutions and legislation, we have the ground for the culture. And that culture is simply the foundation and parameters for the way of life of the people. So when the ideology changes, when the philosophy changes, you can be sure to know that the political structuring changes. And when the political structure changes, the political culture changes, then you're going to have new laws, new constitution, a new law, a modification to the constitution, or amending of the constitution. And from the new constitution, laws, legislation, you're going to have the foundation and parameters for what is right, what is correct, what is moral, what is immoral, what is ethical, what is unethical, what is good and noble, and what is immoral. So the new moral ground will establish the traditions, the customs of the people, whereby giving a new pivot for the formation of the new way of life. And when you have that new way of life, you're going to have increased prohibition of the outsiders, or prohibition of the thoughts, the practices, the beliefs, the traditions of the outsiders. And in this case, in the 21st century world, in Western civilization, the outsiders happen to be those who believe in the Bible, or those of the Abrahamic faith tradition. If you're of the Abrahamic faith tradition and you hold to the Abrahamic faith traditions, then there's no place for you, or increasingly there is no place for you and your conservative views in the Western world. And as a result, the beliefs, the values, the expressions of the Abrahamic people are considered hate speech.
Say something now. Stand for what is right. Live for what is right. Beg you do what's right. Christian man, Christian boy. Stand for what is right. Christian.